Please be seated. Well, this past Wednesday, Ash Wednesday, we began what we in the Christian church call Lent. Lent. Always a favorite season of the church year for some of you, I'm sure, with all of that penitence and fasting. Perhaps you know that the word Lent is derived from an old English word that means spring or lengthening of days. And as one writer I was reading noted, she says not only is it a reference to this season we have before Easter, but as she says, it's an invitation to the springtime for your soul. It's an invitation to the springtime of the soul. I kind of like that. And I kind of want to offer that up to you as a way that we all might approach this Lent. A springtime for our soul. We heard in the gospel today that Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights and was fasting without food. Now, most likely, it echoes those great stories that we hear throughout the Bible where the number 40 crops up. You might recall that Moses spent 40 days and 40 nights fasting in the wilderness, listening to God and writing down the covenant that God was making with the people. It might remind you, too, that the prophet Elijah was out there in the wilderness for 40 days, waiting to finally did hear that still small voice of God up on Mount Horeb. And obviously, I think it perhaps conjures up for us the memory of the 40 years that the people of Israel spent wandering in the wilderness, learning to trust God. So comes to us the number 40 for the days of this season of Lent. And there are 40, starting at Ash Wednesday and excluding Sundays. But it's really interesting to note that it took a while for the Christian church to settle on the number 40. For the first 3 centuries, it appears that they took no more than about 2 to 3 days of fasting before Easter and to celebrate it. And I'm sure some of those devious minds out there are saying, Bruce, why don't we return to that? 2 to 3 days, 40, I'll take the 2 to 3, Let's just cut to the chase and get over with it. Well, I kind of wish we could, but we're not. We're not, because ever since about the 4th or 5th century, it's been the custom of the Christian church to observe this 40-day period. This 40-day springtime of the soul to do something very, very important. And in that time, Christians were invited to draw close to God. That was the purpose of Lent, to find time to draw close to God. And it's observed, I think, as many of you know, by not only taking on things that might draw you closer to God, but also fasting from or stepping away, abstaining from those things that might steal your attention or distract your attention from God. I received an email. Well, actually, I received an email almost every week because of a conference I went to back in July. And a couple of weeks ago, they sent me an email all about, getting me kind of thinking about this time of Lent. And the title of the email has just stuck with me because their theme for this time of Lent was feeding and fasting for Lent. I like that. Feeding and fasting for Lent. Not only what do you get a fast on during Lent and step away from, but what do you get to really feed on? What do you really get to, I like to say, feast on that's going to draw you closer to God? I kind of like that. Fasting and feasting during Lent. So, what are you thinking about fasting from this Lent? Don't tell me. I don't want to know. Seriously. But I do think it's good to tell someone. And I found that because it makes you accountable. I found that out with my family the other night. I told them what I was fasting from, and they said, look, you're not fasting. So anyway, tell someone at least what you're fasting from. So many people during Lent fast from food, certain types of food, and that's what our biblical ancestors did. They fasted from food, from certain types of food, and also from quantities of food. And I know people who, during this Lent, fast from, let's say, red meat, or they fast from all meat. And I do know that some people fast from, chocolate and ice cream. I've never understood that. So I don't do that kind of stuff. So the question is, the real question is, if you're going to fast from it, so what are you going to do that's going to help you draw closer to God by that fast? So if you're just, fasting from fast foods, let's say, just because you want to trim up a little bit, that's not quite enough. It's more that if you're going to fast from a food, how is that going to make you be mindful of ways to connect with God or be mindful of God in your life? So I guess the way I would look at it, if you're picking some food to fast from, maybe what you would do is then think about all the nourishing foods that you were eating during Lent that remind you of this good earth that God has given us and the good nutrition and all of that God enables to come forth and give us life. And that way you can be thankful to God. Now, often some of us consider fasting from things other than food during Lent. So maybe you might want to think about fasting from your, this is my smartphone, I want you to know that. For electronic devices. I mean, how many of us, I for one, spend a lot of time staring at my computer at night, playing with my iPhone, HDTV, whatever it is. Lots of electronic devices consume a lot of our attention. What about now I'm not saying completely give them up, mind you, but why not fast from them in the evening and just step aside and say, no, I'm going to take a break from them in the evening. And maybe in that time that you have now available to you, you might do something like read a good book. Read a really good book. What about listening to some really good music? What about, dare I say, taking that time and maybe praying a little bit for family and friends and for our world, people in it? Whatever it is, take some time to have that be a space where you find yourself connecting with God and connecting with what is good and holy in this life. Now, here's one that I bet you most all of us could stand to do, and that is, why not fast from our busy schedules? Take a step back from the hectic pace that most of us lead, and maybe just sit quietly in that silence. Maybe don't try to do anything, but just let that time be your time to silently be with God. And just develop some awareness. Yeah, God's all around me. I mean, I use my busyness to distract me from God sometimes, to tell you the truth. Or why not, if you're going to carve some time out in your busy schedule, why not think about perhaps a relationship with a family member or a friend that you've neglected because you're spending your time running around doing all these other things, and this relationship is withering and dying. Why not during Lent take some time to nurture that relationship, to give it some life and some love, so that indeed you might feast on that relationship? I am convinced that our relationships that we have with each other, our good relationships with each other, are one of the ways that we really can draw close to God and to what is sacred and holy. I also want to just sort of put in a little note there that some relationships are toxic. And maybe during Lent, you might need to fast from some relationships and take a step back. Maybe you ought to think about fasting from driving. I drive everywhere and all over the place. Maybe this is the time to think about, well, how much resources am I using? Maybe I can walk a few places down to the store. And maybe when I walk, maybe that's a chance to notice All the things I'm zooming by in my car all the time. Notice the people that walk by you, or the trees, or the animals, or just your body moving and breathing, and use it as a time to thank God for that time of being aware of yourself and others and this beautiful planet that we live on. So fasting and feeding, or feasting, I like that. I'm going to go with feasting from here on out. Fasting and feasting during Lent are good practices. But there's another practice I want to just end with and get you to think a little bit about. And that's one that we heard in the very first lesson today. And that lesson from Deuteronomy. There Moses tells the people that when they have come into the land that God is giving them, they are to give thanks and to give back. To give back. To give away, not give up, but to give back. To joyfully give back. And I think it's interesting that this first Sunday in Lent, the very first lesson we hear is about joyful giving. About giving. Giving. When we take time and space, I think, to really fast so we can feast on God, most of us end up with pretty darn grateful hearts. Because we realize how much we have. And the response to that is to give. To give to others. To give to others in need. And we're going to be doing a little bit of that this Lent here at our church. You've probably already seen there's 3 big barrels back there for the Monument Crisis Center just down the road. So we're going to be giving to support that good ministry. We'll also have a water jug up here for the young kids to put their coins in. And this is going, if you were here last Sunday, you heard me talk about our missionary, friend of mine, Stephen Smith, my son, who's in Africa. And one of the things he does, in addition to the school, is he works at this little Episcopal church called St. Augustine's in Grahamstown. It's out in what they call a township or a location. They're very depressed places. And he goes there once a week with one of the brothers and helps with a feeding program and with games for the kids. And they are running really low on funds for their afternoon lunch feeding schedule, or feeding program, excuse me. So we're going to be asking young people when they come up and light their candles at the icon of the Good Shepherd, if they'd like to drop some coins into this jar. It's really kind of fun because it makes a lot of noise, you know. So hit your parents up for some coins, kids. When they come in, I guess I'll go tell them to do that. But anyway, think about giving during this time of Lent. So, let me just conclude by saying, if you haven't done so already, it's not too late to think about, fasting from something this Lent. It's not too late to think about feasting on something this Lent and to give. Consider fasting from those things that get in your way of being aware and connected with God. And feed on those good things that make you aware of God and God's love working in this world and in this life. And do a little bit of giving too. So as we enter this Lent, I invite you all to a springtime for your souls through fasting, through feasting,